We have done these sessions primarily for professional and personal development while we're in this COVID time. And I guess this one's a little bit of both, professional and personal. And just next week, next Thursday, just an FYI, we have Todd Snyder, the menswear designer. He will be interviewed by Randy Cousin, a VP of merchandising at Tommy Hilfiger, and they'll be talking about the future of menswear. But today we have a couple special guests. We have Dustin Wilson, who's a master somm and co-founder of Verve Wine. And we have my friend David Bruno, who is of Bright Endeavors. He's been in the fashion world, but now is doing consulting in fashion, retail, and food and beverage. And I'll let these two take it away from here.
Cool. Hi, everybody. I guess I'll kick it off because I'm kind of the how this all came together here. But most recently, I did work very closely with Todd Snyder to start up the Todd Snyder menswear brand. Left that about 2 years ago to start my own consulting company. And as Joe mentioned, I do work in the food and beverage space as well as the fashion space. Most recently, Dustin and I and Chef Austin Johnson were consulting on the Goodman's Bar, which was about a 30-seat restaurant inside of the Bergdorf Goodman's men's store that is obviously currently on pause, just like most restaurants. But I've spent most of my career in fashion, actually all of my career, save the last 2 years, working at Bergdorf Goodman, Simon Spur, which was a menswear label, and Urban Outfitters and Macy's merchandising. So I come from a long line of merchandising and fashion, and got the wine bug kind of early on with some family members introducing me to the wine world, and kind of knew I was headed in that direction. Was kind of reinforced when with Todd Snyder, we did the uniforms for 11 Madison Park, the restaurant in New York. We did their uniforms when they redesigned the entire restaurant, and Todd Snyder and I were opening the Madison Square flagship store. So we were kind of just going around the square, introducing ourselves to everyone. And when we sat down with Will Gadara and Chef, they basically kind of laid out a plan and said, would you guys like to do the uniforms? I answered for Todd and said, we'll do anything you guys want. That was kind of a crazier ask than we expected, but we got in really close with their team there and we signed on before they won Best Restaurant in the World. So we were part of that whole process. And I got to be friendly with Cedric Nicase, who's the current wine director. And I kind of filled him in on, my plan to leave fashion and move into a little bit different space. And he introduced me to Dustin, who was working on the Verve Wine brand that he'll tell you a little bit about. And we hit it off and started to work together. So we've done some cool stuff together, and there's a lot more to come, but I'll let Dustin kind of fill you in on who he is and what we're going to do today.
Cool. Hey, everybody. Nice to see all of you. Great to be here. Thank you for having me. So a little bit of my background. I grew up working in restaurants, from a fairly young age, and kind of did pretty much everything there was to do in restaurants. I'm originally from Maryland, from just outside of Baltimore. And, I've done everything from kind of been a dishwasher to a busboy to wait tables, cooked on the line, was a fry boy for a chunk of time. You name it, I've probably done it in a restaurant setting. But it was when I was in college and I was working in a restaurant as a waiter down in downtown Baltimore that I kind of caught the wine bug. It was like my early 20s. I think I was just turned 21 or 22 or something. And it was a nicer restaurant that had a nice wine list. And, I clearly didn't know anything about wine at all. But I quickly learned I had to figure it out, at least to be able to fake it for the dining room floor to get by. So, started reading about it, bought Wine for Dummies, which was my first wine book, and read it cover to cover, and basically kind of never looked back after that. I just, for whatever reason, was really drawn into wine. I think for me, it was the combination of all these various disciplines that kind of go into it. It's a little bit of history, it's a little bit of geography, it's geology, it's chemistry, all these things go into learning about wine. I found it to be fascinating. So much so that I was, kind of spending all my free time reading about it, going to the wine stores and perusing the aisles for, much longer than I probably needed to be there, and buying wine and taking it home and reading about those wines. So fast forward a bit, and I planned to move to Colorado after college. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I was a geography major and didn't know how I was ever going to use that. So my original plan was to go to grad school, but I wanted to move to Colorado for a little bit and get some time in the mountains. I love to ski, so I just wanted a little time to kind of goof off and figure out what I wanted to do. Spend some time skiing. And when I got out there, I landed a job as a waiter again at a small little Italian restaurant in Boulder called Frasca Food and Wine, that happened to have a master sommelier as one of the owners. And I had heard of these master sommeliers, these elusive humans that know a lot about wine, but I had never met one before. He was the first one that I had come across. And so I was like, oh man, I got to work here because I want to learn about wine from this guy. I'll ski during the daytime and I'll just work at night and learn about wine from this guy. And my plan was to spend about a year, maybe two there, and then come back. But I quickly realized that I fully fell for wine and wanted to make a career out of it. So that was when I kind of started going down the path of taking the quartermaster sommelier's exams. And really kind of committing to becoming a sommelier. So that was the kind of the launching point. And from there, I got lucky to go work in Aspen at the Little Nell Hotel, 5-star, 5-diamond resort right at the base of Aspen Mountain. I was there for a few years as a sommelier, left there and went to work in San Francisco at a place called RN74, which is part of the Michael Mina group of restaurants. No longer exists. It closed, I think, like 2 years ago now. But continued to learn a ton there. And when I was out there is when I passed the Master Sommelier exam. And during that period as well, kind of got lucky and pulled into this small group of four of us who were filmed as we were going through the process for a wine documentary that later launched about 2 years later, called Somm. I don't know if anybody's seen it that's been on here, but during that period, after passing the test, I ended up landing a job at 11 Madison Park as the wine director back in 2011. So came out to New York then and spent about 4 years there. And left there in 2015 to start my own business called Verve Wine. And now what we do is we're effectively a wine retail business, but we've got, I kind of like to think of us as your go-to kind of great neighborhood shop for online shopping, if you will. Kind of more curated, very thoughtful and intentional selection of things. But we also have locations both in San Francisco and in New York City, and soon to be Chicago. We're a little over about 3.5 years old at this point. And so, my role is basically, I find killer wines at every price point and things that I really believe in, that I love. And we tend to focus on things that are, made by real human beings, people who love to farm their land, who also are involved in the winemaking process. It's usually small families, smaller properties that are very hands-on throughout the whole process. We don't normally deal with a lot of kind of large-scale mass market, big brand type of wines. And, for us, it's really important that the wines are A, really delicious, and then B, they also kind of really represent their place and time really well too. So that's kind of how our ethos around how we choose the wines. And we've tried to really lean into how do we take that mindset and bring it to a broader audience. So that's what Verve is really all about.
Cool. So I don't know if any of you guys have the wines that we recommended, but we're going to jump into the two just real quick, and then we're going to get more open and kind of field questions and have a little bit more fun. So if you don't have the two wines we have, I recommend drinking something. you know, doesn't have to be alcoholic, but it's fun to drink while other people are drinking. Dustin, you wanna take us through what we've got here real quick?
Sure, sure. And also, while we're chatting, feel free to ask any questions that you have. David and myself, we're both, even though we're geeky about wine, we're both also extremely laid back about it. So, feel free to ask anything that comes your way. So the first wine is the Vino Bianco from Miliuve. It's a small little producer in the very northeastern corner of Italy. I'm in the area called Friuli, Venezia Giulia. It's if you're looking at a map, it's kind of the very like top part of the boot on the eastern side. It borders Slovenia and Austria. It's a really unique area because it's not necessarily like the rest of Italy. It's much more about rice and olive oils and things like that, rather than pasta and tomatoes and red sauce when it comes to food. It's got a lot of German, Austrian influence. A lot of the culture that you see there, both the food, some of the signage, the types of people that are there. It's got a much different vibe to it than other parts of Italy does. And the grape varieties are also quite unique. One of the fun things about Italian wine is they grow different things in basically every different province. So, if you're in Tuscany, you tend to be drinking things like Sangiovese. If you're in Piedmont, you're drinking probably some Nebbiolo. If you're in Sicily, you might be drinking some Nerello Mascalese. But in Friuli, there's a handful of grape varieties that are native to the area. And it's also probably Italy's most famous region for white wines. So when I think of great white wine places in Italy, this is for me the very top. So the wine that you have here, the first one is a blend of a local grape variety called Friulano. They call it that because it's kind of the most quintessential white grape of Friuli. To me, it tends to drink like a slightly more aromatic and more interesting version of Pinot Grigio, if you will. It tends to be really light, easy drinking, very refreshing. But it has a little bit more going on with the aromatics than Pinot Grigio typically does. It's also blended with another grape called Malvasia, which is also not local specifically to this area. You see it kind of around this region. You see some over in Slovenia too, actually, kind of places around the Adriatic there. And Malvasia is also quite aromatic. It has a lot of floral notes to it. So, for me, when I smell and taste this wine, it's very clean and it smells really fresh and vibrant. It's got a little bit of a floral kind of perfumey thing to it, but not so much so that it's kind of in your face. And then on the palate, it's really just clean and refreshing. And this is a wine for me that I love to drink this time of year, just when it's hot outside. It's just great, nice and chilled, and you don't need anything to go along with it. You can just chug it, and it's great. But if you did want to pair it with something, it's like great for perfect summertime foods, like great little piece of clean fish or some shellfish. You can pair this with oysters. Any kind of light seafoody type of things that you maybe want to eat while you're sitting outside on a warm summer day. This is a great wine for that. The producer, I should say too, is a producer named Borgo del Tiglio. They're a small little family property right on the border, actually, between Slovenia and Friuli, right, and that part of Italy. In the last, I'd say, 10 years or so, they've really turned into one of the most kind of cult winemakers or wineries in Friuli. This is what I would consider to be kind of their entry point wine, just a kind of the wine they make the most of, and certainly the least expensive of the group. So it's a great introduction into kind of their style, but some of their higher end single vineyards, Friulano wines and whatnot, some other blends that they do are really sought after, have won tons of great awards, and go for a lot more money than this one typically costs. So I like this a lot because for me, it's, I like finding things. I don't spend a lot of money on wine personally. I've worked in really fancy restaurants my whole career, and I've been able to taste a lot of really amazing things. But, when I crack something open on a random Tuesday or Wednesday night or something, it's usually not, a couple $100. My limit's usually around like 25, 30, maybe 35 on a big night. So I personally really enjoy finding, really delicious wines that are also really incredible values. And I love when you can kind of take like a really sought after, really amazing winery like this and get into something of theirs on the lower price scale. So
Yeah, I think that's a special part of what Dustin is an awesome merchant at wine. So finding a merchant or a sommelier that you really trust that can guide you into values, because as we all know, we're all drinking a lot more wine now, but we're not spending a lot more on wine. So finding those access points where you can see somebody like these guys who do a wine that is 20 to $24, but you're drinking a winemaker that makes incredibly cult wines that very rarely make it to homes, honestly, because, and I just saw a question, what causes the difference in price? And oftentimes, like particularly for this producer, it's just how much they make. So they're able to make more of this wine because they maybe either grow more of the grapes, or they work with or surrounding vineyards to purchase more grapes to make a wine that they can get into the hands of more people. So the vast majority of price, when you're talking about some of the people that we work with that are smaller producers, they don't have an ad budget. This is, kind of talking about, something, comparing a startup fashion brand with zero budget to Chanel. There's a lot of, you can make the exact same product in the same factory. There's going to be different cost structures that are around it. This, very little marketing, just as much as they can make, try to get out. And if they're making only a handful of cases, it's unfortunately, because it's cult, it's going to go to the hands of fine dining restaurants. So that means the price, that if it makes it out of the restaurant, it's going to be incredibly elevated because of price. So it's essentially supreme drops. That's a very easy way to think about wine. It's $20 on release if you can get it. You get your hands on it, and then you resell it for a lot more. And there's a lot of different ways the industry is set up to do that. So there's ways that it goes from the producer to an importer to a distributor. Everybody's is kind of set up to make their margin, and then when it makes it out into the greater market, there's a, just like sneakers, there's a very large market for auction and trading and gray market wine. So the cool thing, I think, when you think about price is that if you find a great merchant, you can trust them to get you things that taste, as this wine does, like it's a lot more expensive. It's an excellent wine at a great price from an awesome producer with clean fruit and clean farming practices that would be just vastly more expensive from a slightly different producer with a different price structure. So it's, a lot of it is marketing and who owns the label. But if the best thing to do is to focus in on those everyday price points, whatever that is for you, and find value that is outperforming. And that's helpful with a good merchant or a master sommelier. So
yeah, I mean, there's definitely choice in the winery too. Like if they've got, a certain amount of land, they're going to save what they feel to be the better grapes, for instance, for different cuvées, and then I don't want to say lesser quality, but if you've got like, everything's very good quality, but they might make a very choice selection to go into the top wines where, they're not as nitpicky about what goes into the less expensive wines. So there's usually also an element of quality of the raw ingredients that go into it also. But David's right. I think, not all wines, but certainly when you get into the top tier, the more collectible things, the expensive things, the cult things. It has less to do with the actual costs of production and more to do with rarity and demand. But that's why I take a lot of pride in selecting these less expensive things, because I think and David kind of nailed it. I like to find stuff that drinks more expensive than what it actually is. So I mean, for me, this drink's like something that's more around the $40 price point. I think it's like 23 or 25. So
agreed.
For me, that's a win.
And Dustin, I saw a quick question here. If you just want to, so we're drinking white wine. You want to just go through the noble whites and kind of give a quick rundown on?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's almost endless amounts of different grape varieties out there. Depending on where you are, what country you're in, what part of that country you're in, they might be growing different things. Different grape varieties are successful in different types of climates, on different types of soil, etc. But kind of the big handful of white grape varieties would be probably Chardonnay, which produces a grape that kind of grows really easily in a lot of different places. That's why you tend to see it in a lot of places. It's fairly resistant to all forms of weather. It can survive the cold pretty well. It does okay in warm climates too. Kind of grows pretty well on a variety of different soil types. So it tends to become a bit ubiquitous in that sense. From a style standpoint, Chardonnay is usually pretty full and rich and textured, and also likes to be aged in oak. So you oftentimes see Chardonnays that are aged in oak barrels. Not always, but more often than not. I would say another kind of noble grape or one of the more classic varieties would be Riesling, which grows in much less places than Chardonnay does, but it tends to like cooler climates, so colder places. It's a quite hardy stock, so it can survive very cold winters, and it's also one of the grape varieties that can ripen properly even in cooler climates. So you tend to see it in areas that are quite cool, hence why you see it in places like Germany, Austria, and places like that. Riesling, I think, gets a bad reputation for being sweet all the time, which it's definitely not. The only reason it's sweet in Germany is because they stop the fermentation, partially through it, so it leaves a little bit of sugar left over. But if you ferment it normally, just like you would ferment, a Chardonnay or this white wine that we just had, for instance, it goes totally dry too. So Riesling by definition is not sweet. It just is. It can be sweet depending on where it's being made. But regardless, it always has pretty high acidity. It's always very refreshing. It's got much more of a kind of lean palate feel to it. So unlike Chardonnay, which is kind of rich and round, Riesling's is kind of the opposite of that. It's like really tart, refreshing, energetic, really good for this time of year. Like a dry Riesling is one of my favorite things to drink when it's hot outside. Sauvignon Blanc is also kind of mimics Riesling in its texture and its characteristics when it comes to the palate feel. But Sauvignon Blanc, many of you have probably had before. It's got a really distinctive aroma to it. It usually smells a lot like green bell pepper or green herbs of some sort, like tarragon, or it's got like a grassy kind of element to it. It can smell. It has a very kind of unique, aroma to it. Sometimes it comes off as kind of spicy. New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, for example, smells a lot. To me, it smells like jalapeno peppers. So if you like that sort of aroma profile, you probably love Sauvignon Blanc. And then one of my other favorite grapes, which I would definitely consider a classic, but it doesn't get as much love, and attention as some of those others I just mentioned, is Chenin Blanc. I think Chenin Blanc for me is one of my favorite things to drink. You typically see it most famously in the Loire Valley in France, but also has pretty high acidity and are typically dry. But it also has a little bit more richness and weight to it. So kind of combining the fun things about like a Riesling and a Chardonnay, for example, and you get Chenin. slightly different flavor profile, but it's very fun, very fun. Is that kind of? I could go all day with the grapes, so that's probably good that I
Shannon's
stop.
also a great way to not spend a lot of money. You can get Shannons that are, drinking for a much higher value than you would get if you were trying to go buy white Burgundy, for example. So,
Mm-hmm.
so I think somebody asked a question about skin contact wines, which I know if you've gone out to a restaurant or a bar in the last year or two, a lot of people, it's very trendy to talk about skin contact wines, or you might have heard orange wine. That's purely a stylistic winemaking technique. So when you make red and you make white wines, they're different processes. So when you traditionally, like this wine, you take the grapes, you press them, you take the juice, and the juice would be what you'd make wine with. You'd get rid of all the skins. When you wanted to make this wine orange, which actually from this area, a lot of his neighbors do that process. They'll press it, and then they will take that juice. They'll kind of leave all of the skins in with the juice and let it commingle. And prior to the fermentation, it'll just kind of macerate in the skins. So you'll get a final wine that will have some color to it because it's sucking up tannins from the skins. So that will come out orange. Changes the flavor profile, it changes the body of the wine. It's a different type of wine. There's some incredibly complex orange wines, particularly from Slovenia and the Friuli kind of area. But it has become a trend. So you'll see stuff that is orange, might not have spent time on the skins. It might have been colored. It's definitely a big trend. And if you ask for skin contact wines, I think that's the best way to ask for it. Skin contact white wine, rather than an orange wine or some color. Ordering by color is going to not be good for you or the sommelier. So I think hopefully that answers. It is important because it is very interesting wine and very historic. If you want to delve into the history of wine, most of the white wine was when we started thousands of years ago was probably very, very orange, made in Georgia in giant amphora qvevris that they just dug in the ground, and when it fermented they took it out, so it was pretty dark orange. But it's a cool wine, and that kind of bounces back to once you kind of dive all the way into wine and you know all of the things that are kind of the generally accepted pillars of wine, the opportunities for fun and value and just nerdiness points often lie in finding the discoveries that are not celebrated currently. So orange wine was particularly one of those things, a historic way to make wine. Predominantly people who were making that type of wine were farming organically or biodynamically. So it ticked a lot of trends, and it's a wonderful wine with food. It pairs really nicely because it can basically go through your whole meal. So you can open a bottle of orange and have it with your salad or your lighter course, and it'll stand up to a little bit heavier courses because of the tannins. So it's a nice versatile wine. Jumping into some other questions. Minerality. Justin, you want to do a snapshot of minerality?
Sure. Yeah. So when we talk about minerality in white wine, it's usually more just kind of a referencing a flavor more than anything. It's to me when I smell like a white wine and it smells like, it's like I'm trying to think of like an example. If let's say when you go to the ocean or you go to the beach, right? You kind of you're walking towards the beach, you're maybe like heading towards the dunes, and then you can start to smell the salt water. Like I think everybody's kind of gotten that before. Smelling that kind of sea spray and that like saltiness in the water is kind of one example of what I think about when I think about minerality in a white wine. Sometimes you can smell a white wine and kind of smell whether it's saltiness, or sometimes it might smell like a rocks might smell if you're like on a hike and you're in the woods and you're maybe by a riverbank, you know, and kind of the water bouncing off of the rocks there. I know it's kind of weird to think about that because nobody actually ever picks up rocks and like smells them.
Yeah, if you see someone
I
smelling
certainly
off,
haven't.
yeah.
But generally when people talk about minerality, you're referring to basically it smells a bit like a certain rocky, like rock type profile. But what's interesting, and it's been proven that the minerals that are contained in the ground don't actually make their way into the grapes themselves. So there's no transfer of minerals from the ground to the actual glass of wine. But you know, depending on again the type of soil that a vine is growing in, it will react a little bit differently in that soil. Like if you take a Chardonnay vine, for instance, and plant it in slate, or you plant it in limestone, or you plant it on clay or gravel or some other, you know, soil type, and then you make it the same way, it's actually going to smell and taste a little bit different because the impact of that soil and the things that it does to it, the environment that it's living in will change the flavor profile. So what's interesting about it is, you know, when you smell like a wine that's been made from grapes that have been grown on limestone, typically, whether it's a Riesling grape or a Sauvignon Blanc grape or a Chardonnay grape or whatever it is, you can actually smell this kind of like commonality through it that sort of smells like, you know, wet limestone rock. You know, it's like a very calcareous, like chalky sort of profile to it. And a wine that's been made from grapes grown on slate, you know, will smell a little bit differently too. So when we talk about minerality, it's usually we're talking about the impression of a type of rock that we're getting when we smell and taste the wine. And that probably sounds ridiculous. I still feels weird talking about it, but that's when we refer to minerality, that's what we're talking about. But the reason that a lot of us like it is because it does help us to kind of, a lot of wine people tend to really like the notion that when you smell and taste a wine, you can kind of smell and taste the place that it's coming from, right? So that's kind of some part of the romance of drinking wine is it should have a story to tell. It should kind of, you know, just by smelling and tasting it, remind you of a particular place. And, you know, the grape variety certainly does that to a certain extent, but then, you know, the impacts of that specific place, the terroirs, as they call it, the mixture of soil and climate and everything that goes into growing that vine, you know, will have an impact on the flavor profile. So when we smell minerality, we're usually like, yeah, this smells like limestone. Like I can smell the limestone. It's so cool. You know, it reminds you of a place. So that's why a lot of wine people tend to dig white wines in particular that showcase a lot of minerality rather than fruit. Because the flip side of that is a wine that lacks minerality tends to be very fruity, which is fine. Like nothing wrong with smelling a bunch of fruit in a fruit bouquet in the glass. Can be very tasty, but it becomes very difficult to kind of get the impression of where this grape variety came from, if that makes sense. So you know, I tend to prefer, I like wines that showcase a lot of minerality over the fruit profile, if that makes sense. Did I explain that okay? Okay. All right. Good.
Maybe we can jump into the red
yeah, let's do it.
as well, and then that'll kind of jump us into the next question of why we get excited about wines and what things you like to sell at Verve.
Do you want to talk about this one, David, or you want me to talk about it? Or
you go for it, and I'll tell you why we like to sell them.
Okay. So this next wine is a wine from a gentleman named David Reynaud. He's a producer in the northern Rhone Valley in France. So this is a place that's very near and dear to me. If somebody asked me what's your favorite red wines to drink in the world, it would probably be the wines from this place. So the grape that's grown up here, the red grape that's grown, is Syrah. Some of you may have heard of it before. If you've drank some Australian wines, they call it Shiraz down there. So Shiraz, Syrah, same thing. Just the Aussies like to call it Shiraz. But the homeland for Syrah, so Syrah is grown all over the world as well. tends to be in more kind of moderate climates, places where it definitely gets a little bit of sunshine and some warmth. But it also likes kind of cool nights. So you see it scattered all over California, some places in Oregon, Washington, South America, you see it, South Africa, you'll see it. You see it almost every country that makes wine is growing Syrah somewhere. But its homeland is in France. And it's specifically in the Rhone Valley, in the northern Rhone, even more specifically. So this place, if you're looking at a map of France, it's kind of in the southeastern corner. If the closest big city would be Lyon. If anybody's been there before, it's maybe an hour's drive or so from Lyon. The more famous regions within the Northern Rhone that you may have heard of before is Côte Rôtie, Hermitage. Those are two of probably the more famous appellations within the Northern Rhone. This one comes from a place called Crozes Hermitage. So the Hermitage is this kind of one really ominous hill that is right on the bank of the Rhone River in the heart of the Northern Rhone. And it's a pretty small appellation, but it's one of the most important in all of France. And it's what it is it's just a giant hill that is south-facing. It's right on the river. It's quite steep. And it's maybe the most famous place for Syrah grown on the planet. The area that surrounds it, so when you get off that hill and you kind of start to get into the flatlands that surround the hill, that's where you see Crozes Hermitage. So they make a distinction between the hill is Hermitage, and then the flatlands that go around it is Crozes Hermitage. So it's just the name of the place, but the grape that they grow there is still Syrah. And that's where this one comes from. And, for me, again, when I think about wines that I like to drink on a regular basis that also provide value, the Hermitage wines, you're not getting into a bottle of Hermitage for less than $100. Like for anything decent, it's $100 is kind of the baseline. But, you can find some really interesting Crozes Hermitage wines like this one for a fraction of the price, and they can be very, very tasty. So this wine is 100% Syrah. The way that he makes it is also I'm a big fan of. So there's a lot of ways you can kind of tweak flavor profiles when you're making red wines. One of the decisions that you make as a winemaker is when you pick the fruit off the vine and you put it in your basket and you kind of take it back to the winery is before it starts its winemaking process, do you want to remove the stem from the grapes, or I should say remove the grapes from the stem, or do you want to leave it all together? And there are kind of advantages and disadvantages of both, but that decision will impact a lot of the resulting flavor profile of the wine. This one in particular, he likes to leave the stems intact, which is, I'm a huge fan of that style of winemaking. I know it sounds like maybe a very small thing to do. David, you might have a good analogy on kind of how that might tie into fashion, but for me, it results in a very different flavor than if they were to remove the grapes. Not a bad or worse, not a better or worse thing.
On the bias, it's the same fabric,
yeah,
but you make it slightly differently. So it's a style.
Yeah, so it's just a stylistic difference. It's not better or worse, but what it results in is if you smell this wine, it's got a lot of really spicy, kind of salty, briny, like almost black olive like aromas to it, and that's partially because of the way this is made. And the reason why I love Syrah and specifically Northern Rhone Syrah wines is because they're so savory. To me, they're very aromatic wines, which I love, but they make you hungry. They smell like smoked meat, black pepper, bacon fat, black olives. Smells like rosemary and thyme. It's got all these really interesting kind of cooking / savory aromas that you just don't get in any other grape variety. So it's super interesting. The reason I fell in love with it in the first place, it was when I was studying for my wine exams. Syrah was the first red wine that I could successfully blind taste on a pretty regular basis. So it kind of led me down this path of saying, well, well, this wine spoke to me first, so this must be like the wine for me. So I've kind of made a career of going to this place in France over the years, and I've befriended a lot of the winemakers, and really enjoy visiting this area and tasting through all the wines. And I think David Reynaud does a really great job. His wines are really, really aromatic and kind of sexy and really fun, but super high quality. But again, I think for a really reasonable price. So I love sharing this one with people. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, and I think also too, I mean, his property is very small. He farms organically. He's been doing it, I think he's certified biodynamic, if I'm not mistaken, for quite some time. And he doesn't make a lot of wine, and that typically is a big reason why it's easy to get behind somebody like that, because it's generally just one guy or a couple people in the family that are making wine, and using a platform like Verve or a restaurant to promote those types of people is very, very exciting, because particularly when you get to meet them and either they come over to the States or you see them in France, they're incredibly taken that people get excited about their product. It's
yeah, to me, it's like, I'm sure you guys can draw the analogy in your industry as well. There's a big difference between like the handcrafted stuff and then like the kind of the big mass produced stuff. And the same thing with wine. I think a lot of people don't realize like how different it can be, but mass market wines are oftentimes heavily processed, and a lot of additives go into it, a lot of chemicals and whatnot in the vineyard. There's a ginormous amount of manipulation that comes into the winemaking process. And oftentimes they are looking to create a product, that fits a very specific flavor profile to target a demographic of people and hit a certain price and things like that. So it kind of loses all sense of like what I think about wine when I think what wine is, right? And it should be like for me, it's a handcrafted thing. And it's, so the wines that we choose and that I like to work with are typically like this. They might not make a lot, but what they do is this guy's in the vineyard every day, and he's the guy like plowing, and he's like helping the team, harvest the fruit, and he's in the winery every day, and he's like paying attention to it, and he makes sure that the land itself is being treated really well. He makes sure that in the winery they're not doing anything to manipulate the wine or add anything to it or fiddle with it to try to hit a specific flavor profile. They're just allowing it to really become what it wants to become. And, I think the ones that are really talented at doing that and having it result into something really beautiful like this, I think for me is what draws me into wine to begin with. So when you go to visit these people, you often visit like their home. They take you into their vineyard and the winery, and sometimes the winery is kind of like in the backyard, and you see really how close they are to the whole process. And I've also been to bigger, mass market wineries where it just seems like a giant factory, and it just loses for me all of the fun stuff of what wine should be about. So.
And I think, the comparison to fashion, you can kind of get away, particularly if you're, particularly stylish or an inventive dresser, with you mixing in fast fashion without anybody blinking an eye. But if you drink mass market wine, like it's a different experience, and it's not as I can't speak to the science of it, but it is not a pure product. It's a manufactured product that you're ingesting, and you make that decision to ingest it. So it could affect you differently. The additives that they have in there, they don't have to disclose, which is one of the crazy things about this product that we put in our body. There's no ingredients on the back of a wine label, and it's not legally mandated. They have to tell you the alcohol content, which is, I think, an easier way for, if you're interested in kind of monitoring what you're drinking, of just taking a quick look at what the alcohol content is on the back of your label and seeing, this Syrah we're drinking is about 14%. You might not want to have the whole bottle by yourself. You can kind of look at the alcohol contents and see what you're dealing with and what the the winemaker intends for that wine to be as well. So you can't fudge your wine. The Syrah that's just labeled Syrah next to a handcrafted Syrah is going to be a wildly different experience. And I know we got some questions about why wine affects you differently. That to me is one of the bigger reasons why, is if you're looking at the alcohol content, and you're looking at how the wine was made, how it was farmed, what you can suss went into the bottle, you'll be better off, and it'll be a little cleaner experience. And
yeah, it's hard to tell sometimes. You can't tell by just looking at the label, which is really frustrating and kind of annoying, and it's not great for consumers that aren't super savvy with wine and haven't studied it. But that's why I think it's important to kind of find a place where you can trust that you kind of know does a good job of that curation and is selective enough for you, that you can buy from. Obviously that's what we do, and I'm not trying to just promote us necessarily. Every city and town has its own like really great little neighborhood spot to buy wine from, but it's definitely, I think, worth searching that place out and finding that place and seeing who's doing a great job in your area and shopping with them, rather than kind of the corner liquor store or the grocery store or something like that, because it's a totally different experience. So
hey guys, I think a couple of questions. I know Amy Peltier has a couple of questions, and maybe Sean can unmute her so we can have a couple of these folks pop in.
Well, I get to be the one that asks my question in person.
I know, so she's fixing the names too. I got here at 15 till 5.
Okay, so should I just read my question?
Go for it.
Well, I had a question specifically about skin contact wines, and about whether they're recommended, if they're like a type of wine that is recommended for keeping on hand. Like, can you age them well? Like, which types are good to age?
Yeah, I can take that. Yeah, it's they actually age pretty well in general. When you keep the skin in contact with the juice like that, it picks up a lot of tannin from the skins, and tannin acts as an antioxidant. So orange wines tend to, generally speaking, age a little bit longer. This is a very wide blanket statement, but generally would age a little bit longer than your average white wine would. So, because of that. So yeah, they can definitely age, depending on the exact wine. I wouldn't keep it in the cellar forever, but certainly a couple of years, if you wanted to just try it out, they're really fun to do that with. I've tasted some really old versions of it, and they can be really interesting. So yeah, definitely. The big key there, though, is if you're going to hold on to anything, whether it's an orange wine or red wine or white wine, is to do it in kind of the right environment. Make sure you're storing it properly. So in a cool place, if you've got one of those little wine fridges, those things are great. Just don't put it in like a closet somewhere next to your radiator or something like that. That's a bad place to be. No bottles up on the windowsill either. That's bad for it too. So
no bueno.
Yeah.
Is there a specific grape that's good, like a great one to age for the orange wines?
Not necessarily. You can make orange wine basically with any white grape variety. You can do it with Chardonnay. You can do it with Sauvignon Blanc. You can do it with Pinot Grigio. You can do it with all kinds of different grapes. So not really. I think
producer
if anything, you may want to.
Yeah,
it's more important about the kind of producer. So again, if you go somewhere where you're like, hey, I want to pick up a couple orange wines that I want to stick in my cellar and age for a little while. I'm sure somebody would be able to point you in the right direction on. But I mean, regardless, again, even with less expensive, kind of more everyday drinker kinds of wines, if you store them properly, they can all last for at least a couple of years, and can be really interesting to try down the road.
Cool, I'll have to try that. And then my other question, I might as well ask it while I'm on the mic, is about, okay, so I love wines from Burgundy and the Loire Valley, but I was thinking more about Burgundy and how, it's such a region that has like such highly coveted wines and like the Grand Crus and everything like that. But how do you choose value wines from a region like Burgundy?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's much tougher than other places in the world, because Burgundy's gotten so popular, and the wines have become so expensive. But I think kind of a good rule of thumb to follow is try to find wines from the less famous appellations. Search out the less famous villages, and you can usually find some good deals there. I also think my favorite way to shop for Burgundy when it comes to drinking things more accessible is, search out the really good producers and then just buy their most basic wine. They're usually their Bourgogne Blanc or their Bourgogne Rouge. The cheapest of the lot, but from a really good producer. Those, I think, you're still not going to be cheap necessarily. Depending on the producer, you might still pay like $50, $60 or something like that. But it's, it's a really killer way to have an awesome Burgundy experience for a fraction of what it might cost to drink their other wines.
Awesome. Good entry point.
So I have a quick question. I think most people who are here are living in the New York area. But for those of us who are unlucky to live in very strict control states like Pennsylvania, where you can only buy any liquor or wine from the government directly, what recommendations would you have for being able to seek out these better value, harder to find wines? Because that seems kind of incompatible when most of what I see at Fine Wine and Good Spirits seems to be from more of the mass market stuff or very high priced in what they call the chairman's selection.
Another good question. It's I've never lived in Pennsylvania, and I've never had to buy wine there, so I can't speak firsthand to the situation. But I'm well aware of the difficulties, and I don't know how they make the decisions about what they carry at the stores. What do they call the stores? Sorry,
they call them Fine Wine and Good Spirits.
Okay,
which is. Some grocery stores have it as well, but they only have Sutter Home and stuff like that, like the most basic.
Yeah. What I do know is that in the last few years, Pennsylvania has opened up their stores to buying wines from more notable importers and distributors. I know, for instance, a number of New York importers have found their way into selling wines down in Pennsylvania. Part of that has to do with the restaurant culture. There's a number of notable sommeliers in various restaurants around in Philadelphia, most notably, that really pushed hard to get some of these wines into the state and onto that state program. So I know they're around. I just don't know how to find them or where they are exactly. I wish I had a kind of a better direction for you. My instinct would be to
and I think the best way is either talking to the manager at one of those stores and telling them what you want, or talking to the sommeliers and ask them where they got it from. One thing I was going to bring up too is that if you don't have a good merchant and you're in a larger store, turn your bottle around and look at the importer and who brought it in. So I think you should do that with every wine you drink, because you can see trends across, if you start seeing wines wow, I'm really enjoying a bunch of these wines and they all happen to be from Grand Cru selections. You're in a good place, the taste of that person. So without a merchant to tell you exactly what you're looking for, if you're in a place like Philadelphia or a larger wine store, you can kind of triangulate yourself to good wine. The one who puts it on the front of the bottle that is an easy win, even in grocery stores, is Kermit Lynch. If you see Kermit Lynch on a bottle, you're in a good place. He puts it on the front of some of his lower priced wines, but if you turn it around, it's an easy. The importer distributor is kind of an easy win when you're looking in stores that might not have any direction or a human being to even talk to. And I haven't been in Philly in a minute, but I know that they were loosening up laws. I was in the Northern Liberties and saw some independent wine shops or people with license to sell package to go. So I know it's happening, particularly in the kind of more natural wine scene. I would say, there's people trying to do some things independently. I don't know the legalities on what they're doing, if that was even legal, but I've seen it a little bit. But yeah, I think personal relationships, unfortunately, is kind of the way you you kind of cut through those.
Yeah, looking at the importers on the label is a really good way to go. Kermit Lynch, Grand Cru, Skurnik, I know is distributing wines down there too.
Or Polliner.
So those are Polliner. Yeah, those are a few that I think are really good.
Or just drive up to New York and go to Verve Wine and put it in your trunk.
Well, also Verve ships to Pennsylvania too, so you can just order online from us as well.
Okay, my understanding from the PLCB was that you could only that you couldn't buy online except from them.
Yeah, I'm sure they tell you that.
Like that.
We ship to Pennsylvania all the time.
Okay, well that is good to know.
Yeah.
Hey guys, Jen Lee has a question on decanting wine and when you should decant wine. So maybe Sean can unmute Jen and she can ask her question.
Yeah, it's twofold. So using the decanter, can you turn that down? So we have a group here. So using the decanter, this isn't working. I'm sorry.
There you go.
I think if there's multiple people there, if just everybody else mutes except for you, then you should be okay.
I think it's because we're hearing the feedback from the device. Just a question about decanting. Sorry.
Yeah. All right. I'll try to answer as much about decanting as possible. So a couple reasons to decant. One is to allow the wine to open up and get some oxygen into it. And you might do that for a variety of reasons. You know, usually darker colored, heavier red wines usually need a little oxygen just to kind of let themselves start to open a little. It'll change the aroma profile. It'll kind of help soften the wine up a little bit. Just getting some air on it is one thing to do. And that's usually for younger, like darker, heavy red wines. You would also decant typically older red wines to remove the sediment. So as red wines age, all the tannins and some of the color pigmentation start to actually form into sediment and will drop out into the bottle. So usually older bottles of wine, you've probably seen it end up with like a little layer of like this kind of gunk, looks like dirt almost in the bottom of the bottle. You obviously don't want to end up with that in your glass. So another reason to decant would be to kind of pour off the clear wine into the decanter so you can kind of leave all the sediment in the bottle. That usually involves needing to either keep the wine on its side for an extended period of time and then just very gently decant it off, or maybe stand the bottle up 24 hours or so before you're ready to drink it, and then doing the same thing again, very gently decanting the wine off, and that's a good way to just kind of keep all the sediment from ending up in your glass. There's another reason to do it might be to change the temperature. So if like the wine's too cold, for instance, like let's say you stuck your red wine in the fridge and to cool it down a couple degrees and then you forgot about it and it was in there too long, a way to just kind of bring it up a couple degrees really quickly would be to decant it. And then for white wines, typically you don't really ever need to decant white wines more often than not. But there are some white wines that are can be a little stinky when you first open them up. Oftentimes that has to do with the amount of maybe sulfur that's trapped in the wine, or if it's been in a really kind of oxygen inert environment for too long, it can trap a lot of like kind of weird aromas that just need a little bit of oxygen to kind of help them blow off and go away. So sometimes white wines that when you first smell them, if they smell a little kind of funky or a little stinky or something like that, just into a decanter, swish it around a little bit, get some air in it, and that'll help to kind of clean the wine up a little. So those are the main reasons to do it. I think when it comes to the timing around it, that's another question I get asked a lot, is usually the bigger, bolder, more youthful red wines need a lot more time. Like a big Napa Cabernet Sauvignon, for example, probably want to give that at least an hour or so in the decanter before you serve it. It just helps to kind of soften it up. Anything that's like kind of lighter than that, kind of go backwards, right? So if it's a more delicate red wine that you'd like to decant, it probably doesn't need as much time in the decanter, if that makes sense. Is that helpful? Yeah. Okay.
And,
Hey guys, I know Dustin, you're a master som, and David Bruno actually seems like he's a master som too. But I'm just thinking that many people want to learn more about wine. I'm curious, and we're kind of hitting the hour mark, but maybe you could talk about what do you recommend for people that want to learn more about wine, whether it's courses or whatever, and then maybe you guys, we take one last question after that, and but this has been great. So
yeah, David, you want to go first on that?
I mean, I'm a relative neophyte compared to Dustin, so following people on Instagram is a great way to do it. See what other people are drinking, what they're posting about, people in the industry. The level of literature that's available on wine is pretty impenetrable. So I'm going to recommend that you look for Raj, and I'll put some info in the list. But Raj Parr and Jordan McKay wrote two books that you can kind of live life just learning the knowledge that are in those two books. But in terms of producers and regions, they kind of tick off all of the really interesting kind of producers that we particularly at Verve work with. And then I'll give a shameless plug to Somm. The Somm team that made the movies has created an amazing streaming platform called Somm TV, SOMM.TV. And they have incredible content from all the way from beginning to more advanced topics that are visual on a closed streaming platform. And they're doing incredible work. There's a lot of conversation going on right now about diversifying access to wine. So they're telling a lot of really cool stories about new producers, new sommeliers, new points of access to the wine world. So I would check out those two, and I'll put Raj and Jordan's book in the links. And then finding great people, be it a sommelier. Sommeliers love to talk. That's their job. So hitting them up on Instagram, your favorite restaurant where you go, asking for the sommelier when you walk in, even if you're not going to buy wine, just meet those people. They're an incredible access, asking other people what they're drinking right now, what producers they're drinking, what wines they're drinking. Just curiosity is much appreciated in the wine business. If you're curious and interested, you're going to get stories. And I think having people behind that makes it easier. That's how I found Dustin. I saw him in the movie and was like, that's a guy I want to learn with and be around. And it's an incredible access point to the wine world because there's so much to see and do. And that's what I find most exciting about it is, it's beyond trend because it's all about the personal enjoyment. So you can be excited about something right now, and then next week something else blows your mind, and it's an incredible unending kind of way to go down the world of wine.
Yeah, those are all really good examples. Highly recommend all that, the books and the Somm TV. I think it's great. For me, it was at least I was maybe a bit more academic when it came to learning about wine, but I was also kind of going through the motions of the exams and things like that. But when I first got into it, I remember the thing that was the most fun for me and seemed to have the most impact was every time I would buy a bottle from the stores, I'd bring it home and pop open my wine book and read about that place and learn as much as I could about that particular place and kind of what grape I was drinking and things like that. So I think if there's one like kind of more like reference book type of book that I would recommend, it would be the Wine Atlas by Jancis Robinson and Hugh Johnson. I think they've had a number of updates to this book and revisions, and the one that's on the market now, I think is maybe 8th or 9th or something like that. It's really great. It's got a ton of like amazing maps in it and, photos and things like that. And so what I would do is that was like kind of my main book years ago is if I went and bought a bottle of like a bottle of wine from a particular place in Italy or something, I'd go home and pop open the book to that region of Italy, and I'd just read all about it while I'm drinking the wine. And that was like my fun way of like kind of traveling through the world and learning a little bit about each place, as I was getting to enjoy that bottle. So, that's what I always tell people, is just kind of like allow yourself to enjoy it, or to learn about it as you enjoy, because I think that's a big part of it. You can very easily get wrapped into the all the nerdy stuff, and there's the amount of knowledge that's out there is absolutely endless. Like I still, even passing the exam, there's so much that I don't know. I'm still learning all the time. So you're never going to learn everything. If you ever meet a wine person that says they know all there is to know about wine, they're full of shit. So, anyway.
you guys have been great and so informative, and I know there's so much more to learn about wine, and you sparked my curiosity. So I'll be doing some more exploring. But the one thing I wanted to do is to end on maybe you talk a little bit about Verve Wine and where Verve Wine is. So if people want to get Verve Wine, and maybe David, if you want to talk about kind of what you're doing and any plugs you want to give, and then we can wrap this up. But and we know where to find you then.
Well, I feel like I gave myself a little bit of a plug on the early side, so I won't do it too much. But vervewine.com is our website. You can follow us on Instagram at Verve Wine. We always put out a ton of fun content on social media. We've got a blog on our site too that is a really good spot to like learn some things in a really quick, digestible sort of way. And obviously you can shop there too. We ship to a lot of places around the U.S., certainly all over New York City and whatnot. So, if you want to just visit it and buy some stuff and read some things and learn, that's a good spot to do it.
Yeah,
Dave,
agreed.
what about you?
Verve is doing great work in terms of content. In wine, it's rare to land on a specific wine and read a little bit about what the wine you're going to have and why it matters and what it is. And Verve does a great job of that. Right now, we're kind of in a holding pattern, waiting for the world to figure out where we're going. But Goodman's Bar is kind of on hold. We've got some restaurant projects that are lined up to open as things normalize, but we're all kind of watching and waiting on all my worlds. But that's we're drinking at home a lot. that's kind of the MO, and cooking a lot and learning new tricks and tools, and that's where we are. That's where we are right now.
Yeah. And again, thank you guys and everybody. We were talking before everyone came on that, the restaurant industry has been hit really hard during COVID, and some of these, independent restaurants have, started to open. So whatever you can do to support them, because if you want to have these nice restaurants available in the future, they're going to need your support. So if you can be there for them, that would be great. And, I appreciate everyone who, joined us this evening. And, hopefully you can join us next week with Todd Snyder and Randy Cousin. We'll talk about the future of menswear, because we also need support in the retail fashion world too during this time. So thank you guys. I appreciate it. And thank everyone for joining. Okay. Thank you.
Paul.
Thank you.